Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on China and the US in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. Polaris Live is in its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global readership for your confidence in our unbiased coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. My guest today is Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar. Dr. Anwar is Research Professor, Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, Jakarta, Indonesia. She has written widely on Indonesia's foreign policy, Indonesia's democratization, as well as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and regional political and security issues. Dewi is co-founder of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and sits on a number of national and international advisory boards. She is chairman, board of directors, the Habibie Center, Social Science Commission, Indonesian Academy of Sciences, and co-founder of the Foreign Policy Committee of Indonesia. Please join me in welcoming from Jakarta, Indonesia, Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Anwar. Ramzan Mubarak.
Yeah. Alaikumussalam. Happy Ramadan.
Thank you for giving us this time, Dr. Anwar, on a time when we are all having questions of where the world is headed, foreign policy. And what I want to do is just start off we have a lot of ground to cover. So let me start by saying China recently surprised the West's foreign policy community by brokering a diplomatic breakthrough to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together. Countries that have been at daggers drawn for decades, I might add. President Xi Jinping just visited Russia and has unveiled a peace proposal for the Russia-Ukraine war, a spurt of diplomatic achievements in an area where I might remind our viewers that the United States' influence has reigned supreme. How is this unexpected diplomatic success being viewed in Indonesia, Dr. Anwar? And what do you think is behind all this? Are people concerned? How is the media talking about it? Your own personal views about how it's impacting Indonesia and Asia in general.
Well, first, take the Middle East. There's been a lot of very wide coverage of the recent peace brokering by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which of course has been of great concern to Indonesia. You know that within the Islamic world, these divisions between the Sunnis and the Shias, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia, has been greatly destabilizing for the region as a whole. Both these countries have been involved in wars in Yemen, in Syria, and so on. And I might say that when the first escalation of the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran took place, over the storming of the U.S. Of the Saudi's embassy in Tehran, after the execution of the Shia cleric. In fact, Indonesia at the time took it upon itself to try to broker offered some mediation effort. President Joko Widodo actually sent the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Mrs. Retno Marsudi, first to visit Iran, to Tehran, and then to visit Saudi Arabia. That was, around 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, at the time, that was just the beginning of this very heightened conflict. And so the whole perception, from Indonesia has been overwhelmingly positive. There's a sigh of relief, regardless of who is facilitating the peace talk. You can't have too many peace brokers, by the way. So the most important thing is that that tension has been reduced, and this has been welcome overwhelmingly. I see that reportings in Indonesia has been just straight reporting, analysis that the conflicts has been relations have been normalized, and that China has played a role. Secondly, there have been a lot of reportings also about why China has been able to play this facilitating role, and that's because of the high level of economic interaction between both Iran and Saudi Arabia and China. So, and China has good relations with both Tehran and Saudi Arabia, and clearly both countries are now willing, to talk to each other, and because of China's special position, because of its great economic importance to both countries, it is China has been able to play this role. And
Absolutely.
so, and you mentioned, about how is it seen, negatively, positive. But I said, it doesn't really matter who facilitates a peace talk. One should always be thankful of it. And I think there is a general tendency to actually welcome, China's willingness to engage in this positive endeavor.
Yes.
And it is not seen in a zero-sum game when it comes to peace. You mentioned that Saudi Arabia is, of course, a very close friend, of course, ally of the United States as well. But there's not much. There's no reporting that China's gain is Americans' loss here. It is not seen in a zero-sum game, because we know very well that the United States does not have diplomatic relations with Iran yet. So it is not really in a position, to broker a talk between Tehran and Riyadh.
Indeed.
And China is really clearly the best placed country now, because it has the clout to influence both countries. But given that, clearly both countries are willing and ready, to go
to do that. So two related questions, Dr. Anwar. One is, do you think sometimes that in the West, the Sunni-Shia divide is slightly exaggerated? That yes, there is, but I mean, and I know that intermarriages between the two are very frequent in Asia and Southeast Asia. Do you think there's a little bit of exaggeration in the West about the Sunni-Shia divide?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, people in Indonesia are not that concerned about the Sunni-Shia divides. We are not as aware of it. But, in the Middle East, I think it differs between countries. Their relations historically, have not always been that good between the Shias and the Sunnis. Like, look, for example, in Bahrain, where the elites are Sunnis, and the majority of the people are Shias, and there have been tensions. The Saudis have been very involved in propping up the government in Bahrain, while Iran is considered to be, encouraging some dissenting movements, some protests against the ruling government, that's sponsored by Iran. So the proxy conflicts in Yemen between the Sunnis and the Shias are real. So I think it probably is different from countries to countries. There are, of course, intermarriages, but the historical conflicts do exist, and geopolitical rivalries do exist. But clearly, it's the tensions do go up and down depending on the geopolitical interests.
Right.
The differences exist, but I think it's more real in some countries than others, and this is more related to politics than anything else.
Thank you for that. And here in America, the headlines were the surprising diplomacy that China now is playing its weight, its economic stature. There was surprise, there was some anguish that are we losing our place in the Middle East, especially the United States. Do you think you view it as alarmingly, if I may use the word, with slight exaggeration, but not much, as it's being played in America, that what's happening? Are we falling behind? This is our traditional playing ground. How do you view it? Do you view it in those terms?
Well, clearly it's different perspective. Southeast Asia is neutral in this. So,
yes.
Particularly in Indonesia, we have equal relations with Iran and with Saudi Arabia. And it is always a great concern for us of these divisions in the Islamic world.
Yes.
Indonesians have always been very critical, of the division within the Darul Islam, the Islamic world, that this the Islamic world are more divided among themselves, and this is all the weakness because it has made it so vulnerable to being, divided and conquered by external powers. From the United States perspective, clearly there could be anguish because in the past the US is the only game in town.
Yes.
It's the patron of most of these Middle East countries. So clearly, if another player comes along, there could be a sense of loss. So, Washington's perspective and Jakarta's perspective, it could be very, very different.
Yes.
But clearly, that it does force the United States to reflect that with China as an active player and actually has the economic wherewithal, to play that role. Firstly, I, as someone who believes that the more powerful a country becomes, the more civic responsibility that it has to bear. It has to become a good international citizen. It has to play an active role in promoting peace and stability around the world.
Yes.
It has to bear more of the burdens of the global commons. And China is no longer just a developing country. So in the past, China tended to be less interested in playing this kind of global mediation and so on, seeing itself still a developing country, much more inward looking, or that its footprint is just around the neighborhood. China will not be trusted as a broker in Southeast Asia because it is considered, we have good relations with China, with good economic relations, but also there are some anxieties in the particularly in the political security field, as well as in the economic field.
That is such an interesting statement you've made, Devi, is that it would not be trusted in the same way as it is in the Middle East.
Because in the Middle East, it doesn't have a history of colonialism there. It doesn't have a history of interfering in the in the affairs of the country. So it could be seen as an honest broker. And when we are talking about peace facilitation, being trusted by all sides is very important. From my perspective, I see that more in a positive light.
And so a follow up on that. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been at daggers drawn for so long that a simple signature on a table, may not end all of the concerns between the two. And so your point about China becoming a more responsible stakeholder in the global commons, I think really is an important one, because now if something were to go wrong with this agreement, China will have to come in and make sure that both sides remember the agreement and try to make it good again. And so that's what you mean, that with such an agreement, China will become much more of a stakeholder and much more of a responsible party?
Well, clearly, if something goes wrong, the broker would also have a negative impact there, because people will say that it's, despite China's influence, despite China's economic climate, it's not really been able to help to sustain the peace. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the two parties concerned, Saudi Arabia and Iran, to ensure that they can sustain these relations in the long run and desist from their very, very disruptive rivalry and using other countries as their proxies. The civil war in Yemen, should end, and also the civil war in Syria. But yes, I believe that China will have a direct interest in ensuring that the improving relations between Tehran and Riyadh should be sustainable.
Right. And how can you connect what's happening in the Middle East at all to your part of the world? It seems as though China's actions in the Middle East are pointing to what experts like you are pointing out, which is that there is a growing recognition that we're headed into a multipolar world, and that the two powers will no longer be the only ones that are calling the shots. Is any of that playing out in Asia?
Well, we are in a multipolar world. In fact, in a multiplex world. It's
Yes.
not just. It's Amitav Acharya said, we are in a multiplex world because not only states are the main actors in international relations, but there are also regional organizations, international organizations, even individuals, for positive or negative results. There are so many players now who have an impact, including, in the past, terrorist organizations shape our
Yes.
order. So we are very much in a much more complicated international structure. If you're looking at it from the status point of view, from a state, it's multipolar, but it's not equal. There are superpowers, there are major powers, there are middle powers that all have roles to play, but also the role of regional organizations.
Yes.
In the Indo-Pacific region, the role of ASEAN is very, very important there.
Yes.
Yes, a serious player.
Well, it's interesting that China, because of its growing economic strength and relations, played this role, the brokerage role in the Middle East. We're seeing, obviously, the pivot to Asia and so on. Do you see tensions rising in the Middle East right now between America and the ASEAN countries, for example? Is there a battle for influence? Is there containment? How do you see the positioning of American policy being viewed in Asia?
Well, the Middle East and Southeast Asia is a different sphere. Within the Middle East, China is not really a major player. That this is the fact that it is a very important economic player in the Middle East, and if I'm not mistaken, its trade figures with Saudi Arabia is around $80 billion, and it's as much as nearly more than 3 times of its figures with the EU, and more than 2.5 times figure with the US. But China does not really have a strategic or geopolitical presence here in the Middle East. This is the Indo-Pacific region is a different matter. This is the primary arena of rivalry between the US and China. China views that it's its own backyard, and clearly it wants to increasingly assert itself and views the US as an intruder, while the US, is regarded as an incumbent superpower in the region, but it is now relatively declining as China ascends, and there is a policy what one might see as real efforts at containment of China, whether it is through the strengthening existing alliances between the US and its traditional allies, Japan. Now with the Philippines has again revamped its alliance with the United States because of concerns about the South China Sea, but there's also the Quad. 3 countries are already allies of the United States, the US, Japan, and Australia. But traditionally non-aligned India has also joined the Quad in what we see as, a general effort to increase cooperation to deter China, if not to contain China. And of course, there is also now the AUKUS agreement, Australia, US, and the UK and US, and the sale of nuclear-powered submarines by 2 nuclear-powered states, nuclear weapon states, US and UK, to Australia, which is a non-nuclear weapon state, which is clearly seen as an effort at containing China. So the Indo-Pacific theater is very different from the Middle Eastern theater, and China here is seen as both an opportunity, particularly in the economic field. For Indonesia, for example, China is already its major, the first largest trading partner, but also seen as a security challenge, if not a threat, because particularly of the maritime security issues, particularly in the South China Sea.
Yes.
So it's much more complicated. And the perception of the United States is also very, very mixed. I'll tell you, Sarwar, I probably commercial. The ICS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore issues a report every year. It's called The State of Southeast Asia, and the 2023. I've just read it, and it's very interesting that in the economic field, which country do you think is the most important? Which country or organization is most important? And all countries, without exceptions, all ASEAN countries view China as the most important economic power in Southeast Asia. For Indonesia, China is perceived to have a great importance of 71.1%. And what is the figure for United States is 5%.
Oh my.
Yes, so we are not talking about 50-50 anymore. This is for ASEAN as a whole. The figure for China has actually decreased after COVID. In 2022, China is regarded by ASEAN as a whole to have an importance of 76.7%, and it went down to 59.9% in 2023. While the United States, for ASEAN as a whole, has slightly increased, 9.8% in 2022 to 10.5% in 2023. But for Indonesia, the figure in 2022, the figure was 67.9% for China. It's gone up to 71.1%.
Wow.
While for the United States, it's declined. In 2022, Indonesia regarded U.S. economic importance at 8.4%, and it's gone down to 5%.
Oh my.
Yeah. So, but the reverse is the case when it comes to strategic influence, political strategic influence. For ASEAN as a whole, it's China. It's also declined from 2022 to 2023. In 2022, China was regarded to have 38.2% strategic and political influence, while in 2023 it's 29.8%. That is for Indonesia. But the United States has gone up for Indonesia between 35.1% in 2022 and 35.5% in 2023. So you can really see,
Yes.
economically, the United States is becoming more and more invisible, while the political strategic arena, the US is performing only slightly better than China.
So interesting. Tell us again the organization, please, that put the report out. Our viewers will be interested.
It is the ICS Institute. It used to be called the Institute for Strategic and Institute for Strategic Nation Studies in Singapore. Okay. Now it is called ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, and the report is called The State of Southeast Asia, and releases a report every year.
Fascinating.
The 2021. You can really see up and down. And for Indonesia again, which is a bit of an outlier, for the whole of ASEAN, the distrust of China is higher than the distrust toward the United States. Namely, the United States is a more trusted player than China.
Than China is. Well, I'm glad we have experts like you to sort all this out. It gets more complicated by the day.
Yeah, so, but for Indonesia, on economic, it's really 50-50. What is your view of the economic influence of this particular country in Indonesia? It's 50-50. 51% said China's influence is good. 50% say it's bad. And the same goes. 50% say that the U.S. influence is good, and 50% say it's bad. So
well, hold that thought for a while. Sorry to interrupt you, because I want to connect that and ask you about the Russia-Ukraine war, right? I mean, we're noticing here that 80% of the world, 85%, as my friend Kishore Mahbubani points out, is not supporting American sanctions against Russia in the UN. But most of those countries who are not supporting US sanctions are critical of Russia invading the country. So what is this dichotomy? What is this all about?
Well, firstly, if one supports international law,
yes,
one will, of course, oppose Russian invasion
yes.
of Ukraine, because that is really a direct violation of the UN Charter. against another country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So most countries, including my country, Indonesia, supported the UN resolution that criticized Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. But sanctioning hurts the bottom line. Most countries are dependent, a lot. My country also, including, are very dependent also on very important imports from Russia. This is the issues of energy security, food security. Russia is a major supplier of energy source as well as for fertilizers, which is very important for agriculture and other agricultural products. So since the war, as you know, the inflation has gone up, the food prices and energy prices have gone up. So so this is the case of one's principles. There's one thing about international law, but at the same time, the pragmatic considerations of ensuring supply chains, particularly on food security and energy security, are not disrupted.
How much of this?
Particularly.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, particularly since we have not really recovered, from COVID. COVID-19 really disrupted the supply chains. So most countries are still suffering from that.
Do you think that there is also something to the point that developing countries make, is that, hey, it's all well and good to talk about a world order, a peaceful world order, but when the U.S. Needed to invade Iraq and other countries, even though the UN didn't authorize it, you waived this principle that you now talk about. This comes up in talks with smaller countries. Do you think there's anything to that, in that countries are seeing America and the West as not being principled when their national interests are involved? Is there anything to that?
Yeah, that is also the case. Well, Indonesia strongly opposed the U.S. unilateral invasion of Iraq.
Right.
So it's been quite consistent. It opposed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Indonesia also opposed U.S. invasion of Iraq, but nobody called for sanctioning the U.S.
Right.
And of course, when we are talking about unilateral interventions, the U.S. has done that quite often. Libya, Iraq and Afghanistan and so on.
Yes.
So Russia and the US, it's interesting that champions of democracies and rule of law, Western allies, have joined the US in unilaterally invading Iraq also.
Yes.
That's been very much criticized in the rest of the world, including in Indonesia.
As we start running out of time here, talking to you is so educational, Dr. Anwar. I wish we could just go on for a long time. But a related question, the West, I was talking to a professor in a well-known military institution in America, and he told me, Devi, that he wishes that America had not described the Russia-Ukraine war as a war between democracy and authoritarianism. He said if we had described it simply as a war of aggression against the UN Charter, that many more countries in Asia would have joined us. India would have, and so on. Do you think that is a correct interpretation, that was a mistake to describe it as a war between democracy and authoritarianism, that it should have been described in a much simpler fashion, invasion of a sovereign nation?
Yeah, I think it would be much more simple. Just, regardless whether if a democracy attacks an authoritarian state, is it okay then? The principle is not whether it's democratic or authoritarian. It's the fact that, one violates the UN Charter, violates international law. Because if you put it in values terms, then it is bad for you authoritarian states to invade a democracy, but is it okay? That means that it's okay for democracy to invade authoritarian state. I don't think so. Yeah. I don't think so. And I think, that has been the excuses being used by some countries to justify, for example, the toppling of Saddam Hussein and so on. We do not, I don't support Saddam Hussein, but I think any country that violates international law should be criticized, regardless of the values of that particular country.
Well, listen, Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar, we have, believe it or not, run out of time. And so I must end this program. But I want to thank you for your frankness, your up-to-date transmission of knowledge to our viewers. And really, thank you very much for taking the time to appear with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And let me take the opportunity to thank our viewers from around the world. We hope you'll be able to tune in again to the next edition of Polaris Live, US and America in the World. And until then, goodbye.